Tonight's program, The Good, the Bad, and the Future of Our Whales, will be presented by Stephanie Raymond, who is a lifelong resident of Puget Sound area. She has always been passionate about sharing the wonders of the Salish Sea watershed with others, and has been joyfully obsessed with the southern resident killer whale population since she was 6 years old. Stephanie was formerly the education coordinator at People for Puget Sound and has been a marine naturalist and deckhand on the San Juan Clipper for the past 11 years. She is currently the education program manager for Orca Network, a nonprofit organization connecting whales and people in the Pacific Northwest. When she is not actively looking for or talking about whales, Stephanie enjoys sailing, canoeing, and backpacking. Please help me welcome Stephanie Raymond. Stephanie?
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, everyone, for setting up this program and for being here tonight when there's a lot of other places that you could be, and the weather is also beckoning us outside. What I would like to do is spend a little time today talking about the whales that we have here in the Salish Sea, just kind of giving folks an overview of the populations that we have here. And also then talking a little bit about the threats and how you can get involved with helping us to preserve these animals. I'm just setting up my screen share here so that we can begin a slideshow with lots of beautiful whale pictures in it. All right. So there we are. Sorry, I have to reshare it with the sound so that you'll also get to hear the beautiful whale sounds when we get to that point. There we go. Okay. Okay, so whales of the Salish Sea. It's a big topic. We have a lot of whales and a lot of water here. And Orca Network is an organization that's been around for 20 years now, helping to connect people with the whales here. And we have several different programs. The Whale Sighting Network is probably our biggest one. This is a citizen science effort where we are asking people who see whales to report them. And there will be information about that later in the presentation. Based on individuals sending us information about the whales that they're seeing, we have a 20-year data archive now of sighting reports throughout Puget Sound and to some degree the San Juans and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, although we don't have quite as much participation there yet. But this information is all made public for researchers and for the public. If you're on Facebook, you can visit our Orca Network Facebook page and see any whale reports that we've had come in as they come in and as we receive them and get them up there on the Facebook. We also have a Share the Water Boater Education and Awareness program. Lots of concern about whales and boats, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that as well. And our goal is to make sure that all the boaters out there understand what the regulations are and what the best practices are for having a vessel operating around a whale. We're also instrumental in the campaign to free Lolita, also known as Tokite. She's the last southern resident killer whale who's left alive in captivity. She was captured in Penn Cove on Whidbey Island in 1970, and she currently resides at Miami Seaquarium in the smallest killer whale tank in North America. There's a lot going on in that story, so that might be a good thing to follow up with a question after the event, or you can visit our website, orcanetwork.org, to find out more about what's going on with Toki right now. We're also the designated organization to respond to stranded marine mammals in central Puget Sound, specifically Island, Skagit, and Snohomish County. And we do have a little brick and mortar location on Whidbey Island, the Langley Whale Center, which is a wonderful place to visit. We've got some great exhibits and specimens there, and a gift shop that features local artists and some really beautiful whale-related stuff. And finally, we have our education and advocacy program, which doesn't have a cool logo like the rest of them do up here, but that's what brings me here today, because we really do want people to understand what's going on out there with our whales and what you can do to get involved. So I want to just start first by defining the Salish Sea. I know this is kind of a new term for some people. Some people haven't heard it before. What you see outlined in red on the map there on the left is the watershed boundary of the Salish Sea. So the Salish Sea isn't just the salt water of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Strait of Georgia, and Puget Sound. It's also the watershed around that salt water, all the fresh water that's draining into it. And that is especially true because of the salmon that run in those river systems. And the salmon on those river systems are the primary source of food for our southern resident killer whale population. We'll talk a lot more about that in a moment. So the whales that we see here in this area of water, in the salt water, we have the killer whales or orcas, of course. We have humpback whales that are returning in record numbers, and that's a really interesting development. We also have a small population of gray whales that returns to the Salish Sea every spring. And we have a small population of minke whales as well, who come out into the area really between Victoria, the San Juan Islands, the Kitsap Peninsula, I'm sorry, the Olympic Peninsula and Whidbey Island, and spend their summers feeding there. We have on occasion, fairly regularly though, over the past several years, had fin whales come in from time to time. And then sometimes we have some unusual visitors, like you may remember that last fall we had a beluga whale come to visit, not really sure why. We've had bottlenose dolphins that were identified from a California coast population that they came in for a couple winters in a row. We've had rhesus dolphins, which are also quite unusual here. They've shown up from time to time over the years. Back in 2020, there was actually a sperm whale in Harrow Strait between Victoria and San Juan Island, and that was the first time in 10 years anyone had seen that there. And from time to time, we've even had common dolphins, and there's a possibility a pair of Brutus whales showed up in South Puget Sound, gosh, about almost 20 years ago now, but no one was able to confirm them. So that's just a sampling of why I have learned as a naturalist to never say, oh, those don't live here, because we never know what might show up that is not occurring in its usual habitat. But those 4 species listed at the top, the orcas, the humpback whale, the gray whale, and the minke whales, are certainly our most common and reliable visitors here. So we have 2 different overall types of whales. The mysticetes or baleen whales, these don't have any teeth, and that would include the humpbacks, the minkes, and the grays. And then the odontocetes or toothed whales, like the killer whales. So odontocetes always have teeth, and the mysticetes have baleen when they are adults. The mysticetes have 2 external blowholes, and the odontocetes only have 1 external blowhole, and that's because the second blowhole has over time evolved into a sound-making organ inside the skull. So now they only have the single, you can think of them as your just like your nostrils. They only have the one that is functional as for breathing, whereas the mysticetes still have 2. Typically, a baleen whale, the females will be bigger than males, and that's the opposite for the odontocetes. The males are usually bigger than the females. The baleen whales do not use echolocation, but the odontocetes do. And finally, the baleen whales typically have a pretty clearly defined migration that involves a summer feeding season in cooler northern latitude waters. And then they will fast during a prolonged migration to tropical waters for their breeding season. Whereas the odontocetes usually don't migrate, or not in the traditional sense. Some people will think of the southern resident killer whales as migrating because they're more likely to be in certain places at certain times of year. And that has to do with the salmon runs much more than it has to do with any sort of overall breeding and feeding season like the humpback whales or gray whales would have. Baleen whales will also tend to be more solitary. We're starting to learn some things about humpbacks that might sort of challenge that theory. But in general, we're going to see them traveling alone, unless they're traveling in groups for protection when the females are traveling with young, particularly gray whales coming up the coast on their northbound migration with their young calves will tend to travel in groups. The odontocetes or tooth whales then live in family pods or social groups. And particularly the killer whales have some really interesting variations of this between different groups of orcas. We'll talk a little bit more about that too. This is just a photo of what the baleen looks like. This is the mouth of a gray whale. So what you're seeing there are strips of keratin that are growing from the roof of the whale's mouth. And you can see a little bit, sort of the center right of the screen, that the back side of the keratin is very fringy. It looks a lot like a straw broom or dried pasta. And so what happens is that the whale will take a huge amount of either water, or in the case of gray whales, because they can bottom feed, sometimes they'll take a mouthful of mud. And in that mud will be ghost shrimp or other small animals, or in that water, maybe they've surrounded a school of small fish. And then they will close their mouths partway and push the water or the sand out through the spaces between those plates of baleen. And the food, the prey species, get stuck against them. And so they're basically filter feeding. And that's how they eat. They can't chew their food. That's one of the reasons that they eat smaller prey. So the minke whale is the most widespread baleen whale in the entire world, but not one that most people here have heard of. It turns out that along the West Coast, this species is quite rare. It's estimated that on the entire West Coast of North America, there are only about 600 of these animals. And there's only about 2 dozen who come into the Salish Sea on a regular basis. And we know that these are individuals because by looking at the shape of their dorsal fins, we can tell them apart. Now, these whales are not the very smallest baleen whale species, but pretty close to it. Their average length is 35 feet, and they can live up to 60 years. And I happen to have a clip of their vocalizations here that I'll play for you. They are one of the loudest animals in the ocean, although I don't think that quite comes through with our... It's kind of a strange sound that they make out there, but that carries a long way and apparently is as loud as a jet engine when they really want to say something loudly. So minke whales will lunge feed. And you can see in this picture those stripes under the chin. Those are actually grooves in the bottom of the whale's throat that can expand like an accordion. So what the whales will do is swim around and look for the shadow of a school of fish at the surface. And if you look carefully in this picture too, you'll also see there's some little fish kind of flying through the air there right in front of the whale's face. The whale will open its mouth and expand its throat and can just encompass almost the whole school of fish as it lunges up out of the water. And then it will squeeze the water out and catch those fish and swallow them. Now you also notice all the birds in this picture. Locally, the minkies do what we call bird-associated feeding. Whether or not they are listening for the sounds of the birds or exactly how they know what's happening, they're looking for birds that are actively feeding on these schools of forage fish close to the surface of the water. So we'll see them go. You'll see a clump of birds on the water, and suddenly you'll see a whale like erupt out of them, lunge feeding through this group of fish. The birds all take off, and then they go and land someplace else. And pretty soon here comes another whale through that group of birds. So we know that they somehow are zeroing in on the bird activity as a means of, this is exactly the right place to try to get a mouthful of fish. Now, humpback whales are similar in that they also have those grooves on the underside of their throat. They also participate in lunge feeding. They are the largest whale that we expect to see regularly here in the Salish Sea. They can live up to 50 years, 40 to 45 feet in length. And these are a really interesting story here in the Salish Sea. One of the very first commercial whale watching operations that ever existed here was to look at humpback whales that lived in the Gulf Islands of British Columbia. And there was an operator in Vancouver, British Columbia, who would take people out on a boat to watch the humpback whales. Unfortunately, this was also in an era in the early 1900s when commercial whaling was still legal. And there were commercial whalers who really took advantage of the whales' presence so close to settlements, and they quickly extirpated this whole population. So there were no humpback whales in the Salish Sea for about 100 years. And then here comes this mother humpback whale with her calf, and her nickname is Big Mama. We tell these whales apart by looking at the undersides of their flukes. When they make a deeper dive, they'll show their fins like that. And as you can see here, there's lots of different patterns, so we can get a really good individual marker for each of these different whales. So Big Mama shows up and she's got a calf with her, and they hang around for a while one summer, and the next year she comes back with another calf, and other whales start coming as well. And we're not still sure what it was that started bringing the whales back to the Salish Sea, but specifically mothers were bringing calves back. We had 21 calves that came back with mothers just last summer. And now we have a lot of these whales who are spending at least part of their summer here instead of continuing all the way north to the Arctic, or sorry, to the Gulf of Alaska, which would be their normal feeding grounds for the summer. Now, we also know, because we can identify these individuals and we have people looking at humpback whales in all different parts of the Pacific Ocean, that some of the whales that we're seeing here in the summertime are whales that are also seen in the winter in Hawaii. But some of them are also seen in Costa Rica or off of Baja. And at the moment, the total global population of humpbacks is estimated to be around 21,000 whales. I'm sorry, Pacific Ocean humpback population is estimated to be about 21,000 whales. But that's not a monolith. That's not one specific population. The breeding populations are how they are identified by researchers. And the Hawaiian breeding populations are doing really well. The populations that are breeding off of Central America are a little bit more fragile. And exactly why that is, we don't know, especially since now we know that they are sharing feeding grounds here. And certainly they wouldn't be coming and, you know, bringing their friends and bringing more friends over time if they weren't finding what they needed here. So they're finding plenty to eat here in the Salish Sea. Here's some pictures of the humpback lunge feeding. And they also do the famous bubble net feeding. This is not, though, a behavior that we have seen here in the Salish Sea. This is something that seems much more specific to Alaskan waters. We do see different types of feeding. This is a social cooperative feeding technique that they use in Alaska. And we're only beginning to start to see some particular associations of individuals together here in the Salish Sea. We know there are a few that are hanging out in groups of 2 or 3, but they haven't really started to form what we call a feeding group the way that the Alaska whales have. So we might see that begin to happen, or we might see that the humpback whales here continue to rely on simple lunge feeding, or they also do something called trap feeding, which is essentially where they just sort of hang in the water with their mouths open and really are just sort of waiting for something to swim in. And that indicates that there's plenty of abundant food out there, because otherwise that would not be a very smart way to try to find food. So I take that as a good sign that the forage fish, the little bait fish that these whales are feeding on are in pretty good supply, or that technique just wouldn't work for them. So there's a little bit more about the humpback migration there and the 3 different areas that we see them traveling in as they migrate up and down the West Coast. It was estimated that at the end of the commercial whaling period, the Pacific Coast population was only 1,400 whales. These whales came really close to extinction. But again, our current population is 20,000 or more. And as recently as 2016, some of these breeding populations were removed from the Endangered Species Act. And Hawaii in particular, the whales seem to be doing quite well. And we call this sudden resurgence of humpbacks here in the Salish Sea the Humpback Comeback. And it really is something that's been amazing to behold. I didn't expect to see humpback whales at all when I started working as a marine naturalist on a boat. And then suddenly we saw one, and wow, that was really cool. We saw one that first summer, and now we see them, you know, sometimes those are the whales that are around and not the killer whales, which are the ones that people are usually expecting to see when they come out on a tour like that. Gray whales, interesting story with gray whales here in the Salish Sea. So these are another migratory species. They average in length from 40 to 45 feet and can live up 50 years or more. Again, we can identify these whales by looking at the marks on the underside of their tail, but some of them also have some very specific color schemes on their flanks that we can use, so we don't have to see the tail in order to know who they are. Number 49, patch is very popular among the whales that come into Puget Sound every year. Unfortunately, we haven't seen patch in a couple of years now, and that probably means he's no longer with us. Number 723, Lucifer, she is named that because she has so many white markings. She's not actually what we call a leucistic whale, which would have more white pigment as opposed to being albino. But that's also a play on words because the early whalers who were hunting gray whales would sometimes refer to them as devilfish. So Lucifer and the devil, that was sort of a play on words to give her nickname. The gray whales here they're bottom feeding while they're here. They're the only species of whale that does that. And what they do is as they're heading north on their migration, they will sometimes realize that they have not stored enough fat during the previous year's feeding season to make it all the way back up to the Chukchi Sea. As these whales feed up around the Arctic Circle, they go much further north than the humpbacks do. And they have discovered that there's a spot between Whidbey Island and Everett in that area around the Snohomish River Delta in particular, but also up and down Saratoga Passage, where there's an abundant population of ghost shrimp. And the ghost shrimp live in the sediment at the bottom of the water. So the whales will come up to the shore in water as shallow as 8 to 10 feet at high tide. And from there, they'll roll over on one side and scoop up this mouthful of sand and shrimp. And then you can see as this one's doing, it's pushing the sediment out through its baleen and catching the shrimp in its mouth. So again, the gray whale migration, this map doesn't show how far north they actually go. But again, they are feeding in the cooler waters in the northern latitudes during the summer. And then they start their southbound migration down the coast to Baja California. They're staying there through the winter. And then in the spring, they start to head north again back to those cold water feeding grounds. And again, once they leave those feeding grounds in the fall, they're not eating again until they get back to the feeding grounds the following summer. So if they're not able to have enough fuel, enough stored fat to do that, they will come out, they'll kind of drop out of the migration pattern and start looking for other places to feed. We have a number of them that will do that along the Oregon coast, some in Willapa Bay. While they're in the Arctic, they're eating these little amphipods and mysid shrimp. So they're actually feeding like we think of other baleen whales feeding on plankton that are in the water column. And then the ones that come in here, we have about a dozen who come in every year, and we call them the sounders, and they come in to eat these ghost shrimp. So this is what the ghost shrimp look like. They're not a species that humans typically eat, although we do sometimes use them as fishing bait. And what we've noticed is that we tend to get new members of the sounders population in times when food has low abundance. So if it's been a rough year for whatever reason, either because the population is larger or because something's going on in the Arctic and the food supply is just not what it needs to be, we'll have a few more whales come into the Salish Sea looking for the places where the ghost shrimp live, and maybe they'll keep returning. And right now, this is actually quite late in the season for us to have a gray whale presence in the Salish Sea, but there's actually two different individuals who came in for the first time this year, and they're still maintaining a presence in that area there around Everett, feeding and bulking up. We can tell that they are getting healthier from the food that they're eating there. So they're just sticking around there. They may choose to completely forgo the rest of their northbound migration. We just have to wait and see what they decide to do. So gray whales were removed from the Endangered Species Act in 1994. And then in 1999 and 2000, we had what was deemed an unusual mortality event. And NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, defines that as a situation where you have a higher than normal number of whales washing ashore. There's always a few that strand on the West Coast during the migration, but the unusual mortality event means that you're seeing a significantly higher number than is normal for their population. So those 2 years, we had that, what we call a UME. And during that time, we had the first sounders recruiting coming into the Salish Sea and into that area around Everett. We estimate the current gray whale population is around 20,000, but we don't really No, you know, it might be a few thousand higher, might be a few thousand lower than that. And a new UME was declared in 2019. Now, the numbers on that are starting to look better. We are having fewer whales this year have stranded than the year before and the year before that. But we are definitely seeing some additional recruits coming into our sounders population as a result of this UME. Now, these pictures demonstrate just how important that ghost shrimp feeding ground is for these animals. This is photogrammetry studies done with drones. They fly the drones over whales and they can take a look at their body condition. You can see that whale on the left is looking a little bit skinny. And the whale on the right, just a month later, not even a full month later, has really packed on some weight. So these are the same whale. And that's just as a result of feeding, having this protected area where they can feed on ghost shrimp and just do nothing but that. It really makes a difference for these individuals. Baleen whales in general are threatened by a lot of the same things that the killer whales are: lack of food, which varies from place to place. I think one of the reasons why we had that unusual mortality event with the gray whales is that there's definitely something going on with some of the food production in the Chukchi Sea. And we're not sure at this point if it's climate change, if it's the population has gotten so big that there just isn't enough food to go around, if it has to do with site fidelity, that is that the whales are going back to exactly the same place to feed each time. So if something's happening to cause a particular location to not have enough food, maybe those whales are not looking other places. We don't know if that's true or not. That's just, you know, that's one of those things that we need to do more research on to find out exactly why there's a lack of food. One researcher I spoke to said that they are seeing some physical changes to the water in parts of the area where the gray whales are feeding. So that may be part of what's going on there, that they're, you know, and that may be climate change, and that may be something else too. It's too soon to really know. Pollution, of course, is another issue. These whales are very coastal animals. So if they're swimming through contaminated water, that can have health effects. And if there's trash in the water, as they're bottom feeding, they can't, you know, pick a plastic bag out of their baleen. If something gets in there, they're kind of stuck with whatever they take a mouthful of. Anything that's smaller than a grapefruit, they can swallow. Their throats won't allow anything bigger than that to go through, but they can't really be picky about filtering out anything that's in their mouthful of mud that didn't belong there. These whales are also quite vulnerable to ship strikes because they tend to be slower and they have a low profile. The gray whales don't even have a dorsal fin, so it's easy to miss them if you're not really looking for them. And the other big threat to these whales is entanglements, particularly humpback whales. The majority of humpback whales on the Pacific coast show scar marks from having been entangled in fishing gear. Crab pots seem to be the worst offenders, but that's also partly because there's identifying information on them, and there's lots of other ghost nets and things out there in the ocean that can catch a humpback whale and cause a problem for it. So those are the primary threats that the baleen whales are facing now. So now on to the orcas, or killer whales. These are another really widely distributed whale around the world. And just as people who live in different parts of the world have different languages, diets, and cultures, the same is true for our orcas. And here in the Salish Sea, we actually have two different kinds of orcas, two different populations that do not interact in any way. So I'm going to do some general information about the orcas, and we'll talk about the residents and the transients, so-called, the two different populations that we have here. So average length of a killer whale is 20 to 25 feet. They can weigh 5 to 6 tons, and they can live up to 100 plus years. We don't know exactly 100% for sure that J2 Granny, who was one of the first killer whales that was identified here, was over 100 years when she was born. It's more, when she died, it's more likely that she actually was in her 80s or 90s. But by looking at photographs, historical photographs of Granny, and seeing how far back we could identify her specifically, there were some folks who thought that she may have been more than 100 years old when she passed away. So our two unique ecotypes in the Salish Sea, we have the bigs or transient orcas. Some people call them transients because these whales may be seen, these individuals may be seen anywhere up and down the west coast of North America. There are some who are more associated with the Salish Sea and the surrounding waters, some more associated with Alaska, some more associated with California. But just in the last couple of weeks, we had some of these Alaskan whales who showed up here in the Salish Sea. And about once a summer, we hear about some California whales that show up in the Salish Sea. And we hear about some of the whales that we normally see here showing up in one of those two places. So they definitely do move around as they will. Some people also call them Biggs killer whales in honor of Dr. Michael Bigg, who was one of our earliest orca researchers here and who pioneered the photograph identification technique that we use for orcas and other whales now. Our so-called resident orcas or southern resident killer whales are salmon eaters. And this is a population that is critically endangered because the salmon are also endangered. Now, I mentioned that these two populations do not interact. They don't even speak the same language, and I'll give you a quick example of that. So these vocalizations I'm about to play for you are from the Biggs or transient orca population. And then these, so the southern resident killer whales are made up of 3 different family groups, J-pod, K-pod, and L-pod. And I'm going to play J-pod calls for you here. So this is what J-pod sounds like on the hydro. And then I'll see, I think I can, okay, there's pod. I go back to L-pod. And then K-pod. If I can, maybe that one's not going to go. Yeah, okay. I can't I can't get the button to work, but you can hear that there's a really distinct difference between the transient killer whale sounds and the resident killer whale sounds. The residents can communicate with each other. They tend to travel as extended families. JK and L-pod tend to travel separately for part of the year. And historically, they were seen here in the Salish Sea where they'd kind of come together in this big family reunion that lasted most of the summer in Harrow Strait and the waters of Boundary Pass and southern Georgia Strait while they were feeding on salmon from the Fraser River system. Again, we can identify these whales by looking at their dorsal fins and what we call the saddle patch. That is the white or gray patch behind the dorsal fin. And you can see looking at these animals how distinct these are. Just, you know, you take a quick look, yeah, they all have those tall black fins and white patches, but take a closer look and you'll see how different they are. K20 Spock there in the middle of the picture was just confirmed to have had a new calf in recent months. L72 Racer has that beautiful racing stripe right through the middle of her saddle patch. And then you can see J47 in the lower left-hand corner there. Notch was named for the notch in the dorsal fin. Not the most creative name, but certainly easy to identify based on that name. So that just gives you a sense of how we know which whales we're looking at when we're out in the field. Now, the orcas were never hunted by indigenous people. They have always been revered by the first people of this region. And in fact, there are a number of different groups, indigenous groups here, who consider them to be relatives. The Lummi in particular are really involved in the effort to bring Tokite back to her home waters. That's the whale that I mentioned earlier who's at the Miami Seaquarium. And you can see just a couple other examples here of some ceremonies and totems that were made in honor of the killer whales here. Early attitudes among the settlers, however, were not so great. These whales were feared as vicious predators. It was believed that they would just attack you as soon as look at you. They were also seen as a competition for salmon and in fact were used as target practice by naval planes. So that's, you know, kind of a really ugly approach to these whales. And then in the 60s, we started, some of them got accidentally caught in nets, and we realized they weren't vicious creatures. In fact, they were seen to be sort of friendly, which is probably a bit of a projection, really, but they weren't harming us. They weren't harming their captors. So this era of captures began between 1962 and 1974. Approximately 1/3 of the southern resident population was removed through these captures or killed by accident during the captures. And that was a huge blow to the gene pool of this population. And we're definitely feeling that now as this population is trying to recover from low numbers. Here again is Lolita Toki. We believe that she is an L-pod whale, a member of the L-pod family, and we think her mother is still alive. So whether or not she can actually rejoin her family after spending so many years in essentially solitary confinement, that's a big question. But there's been a recent independent health evaluation that shows that she's in really good shape. There's no reason to think that she would not survive a trip back here. Right now, we're just trying to find a good place where she could be in a net pen while we were assessing what the next steps might be. And that might be where she would spend the rest of her life, or maybe she could be repatriated to her family. No one's ever quite tried exactly this scenario before, but there was a situation around 20 years ago with an orphaned orca from the northern resident population of killer whales that lives up around the north end of Vancouver Island, who was repatriated after winding up here in the Salish Sea. She was repatriated to her family, and she is now a mother with 2 calves of her own, living in the wild. So it's not impossible. So our southern resident population, as I said, it's critically endangered. Between 1995 and 2001, the population was reduced almost 20%. And in many cases, it seemed like the reason was simple starvation, particularly among young males who should be at their prime. We know that in captivity, the males will wait until the female and young have fed before they'll eat. And that may be happening in the wild too. And that may be why we have young males who seem to be dying of starvation because they're letting the others eat when there's not enough to go around. These whales were listed as a species at risk in Canada in 2003 and as a US endangered species in 2005. The US Endangered Species Act does specify that you can designate a particular genetic population as endangered. So this does not apply to all killer whales in US waters. It applies specifically to this small population of whales here in the Salish Sea. And that current population number is 75 whales. That is not 100% confirmed. All 3 pods were in to the San Juan Islands recently, but researchers were not able to confirm the presence of every whale. And there was one particular family group within L pod who wasn't there. So the jury's still out on whether or not we're actually at 75, but it's, hopefully we haven't lost anyone and they just didn't choose to come in for some reason at that point. So why is this the case? Why do we have these whales struggling so much to maintain population numbers? The biggest threat is prey depletion. These whales rely on Chinook salmon for more than 80% of their diet, and the Chinook salmon populations have declined for many reasons. It's a very complex set of reasons why we aren't seeing enough salmon. Everything from pollution to overfishing to dams to shoreline armoring to global climate change. All of these things play a role in why the salmon population has declined. Noise and disturbance is also an issue. It seems as though from the studies that we've done, it seems that the boats themselves do not inherently stress whales out. The presence of boats does not seem to raise their cortisol levels in the science that's been done. However, the noise, particularly of some vessels, occurs in the same frequency range that their vocalization and echolocation takes place in. So it makes it harder for them to communicate and harder for them to hunt for fewer fish that are available. So noise and disturbance is also a big factor right now. And also toxins. Orcas eat high on the food chain. And when salmon smolts are passing through polluted estuaries, they're picking up persistent toxins that stay in your fat cells. And as they are being eaten by salmon, and then the salmon are absorbing more of these toxins, and the salmon themselves are eaten by the orcas. So then they absorb more of these toxins. And ultimately, they wind up with a very high toxic body burden of things like PCBs and PBDEs, flame retardant toxins, things that last a long time. And a lot of the effects that these particular toxins have on the whales are immunological, neurological, and reproductive. So if a whale is unable to find enough food and starts having to metabolize its fat for energy, then that's releasing more of these toxins into the bloodstream, and that can be a real problem for that animal's health. Meanwhile, the transient killer whales, the big orcas, are thriving. They live in exactly the same environment with exactly the same noise inputs and toxins, and in fact may have an even higher toxic body burden than the southern residents do because they eat just a little bit higher on the food chain, but their West Coast population is around 500 and they're increasing at 4% per year. So what's the difference? What's going on here? Well, there's a lot of research involved in trying to answer that question. And this particular research project is one of my favorites. This is that dog that you see on the screen is Iba, and she is a scat sniffing dog. She's been trained to smell orca scat. Turns out that it floats for a little bit after the whale leaves it behind. So what she can do is drive around in this boat behind the whales. So she's not, she's not up in their business and disturbing them. And she can lead researchers to samples that they can take home or take back to the lab and analyze. And through this research, we have learned an awful lot about how the whales are doing. We'll come back to what those results are in just a moment. But first, I want to take a moment to share a sad story that does have a hopeful ending. You may have heard about J35 Tahlequah. She is an orca who gave birth to a live calf who only lived half an hour. And then she carried that baby around with her from July 24th to August 11th of 2018. Now, orcas are the largest member of the dolphin family. And this behavior of carrying a dead calf for a time after it is passed is not an uncommon thing that we see with dolphins. But this length of time that Tahlequah carried her baby was unprecedented. And we refer to this as her tour of grief. It was really remarkable that she spent so much energy doing this. That was not a, that's a heavy body that she's carrying. And during that time, she herself could not hunt. We do know that the orcas will prey share. They will share food with each other, even if they're not really closely related. So that's undoubtedly how she survived this experience. And it also speaks to the fact that, her whole family really was helping her with this and participating in this tour of grief by supporting her, bringing her food so that she could continue to travel with them instead of falling behind. Now, using again the drone study research, we could see that in September of 2019, there's Tahlequah, and she's got a pretty normal and good body condition. When we are looking at these photos, we see that the whales have their eye patches that you see there. You'll notice how her eye patches are sort of pointed out away from each other. If you look at the front of the eye patch and the back of the eye patch, the back is wider. The gap between the two in the back is wider than the two in the front. That's a good sign. That means the whale is in a good body condition. In July of 2020, you'll notice that she is getting a little bit more girth, and that indicates a late-term pregnancy. And in fact, the picture on the right is J35 Tahlequah with her newborn, who has been named Phoenix and seems to be doing very well now. So Phoenix is the hopeful ending to the story of poor Tahlequah losing that calf. So here we have Iba again, and on the left is Tucker. Tucker was the original scat sniffing dog and has since retired, and Iba has taken her place. They are Disney princesses featured on It's a Dog's Life. And what these dogs have found, what we have found from the research done with the samples they have led us to, is that the stress hormones in the whales increase when the food supply is low. Now, this shouldn't be a huge surprise. I mean, if we're hungry, we feel stressed. So the whales are just like us in that. But the really striking finding of this research is that 69% of the pregnancy loss in this population is linked to lack of food. So these whales are simply not getting enough food to sustain a pregnancy. And when you think about the fact that the transient orcas are doing really well, we suddenly have all these humpback whales coming into the Salish Sea and they're eating forage fish. The transient killer whales are eating porpoises and seals, which also eat a lot of forage fish. But the resident killer whales are eating salmon that also eat forage fish, but then there's not as many salmon to eat those forage fish. So that the salmon seem to really be the key issue in why our southern resident population is not thriving and is not able to renew itself to original numbers. Some of the salmon runs have declined as much as 90% in the last century. And this is just a really short list again of why we're seeing these declines in the salmon runs. Again, the dams, it's really hard for the adults to get up past the dams. Even with the fish ladder, it's not ideal. And we know there's lots of problems with predation when sea lions in particular will park themselves at the bottom of a fish ladder, and that's where the salmon have to go. So there's a lot of loss there. But also for the smolts to come downstream through the turbines is really traumatic, and a lot of them don't survive. Habitat loss, historical overfishing, pollution, climate change, again, all of these things, it's death by 1,000 cuts for the salmon population. And that's why we are seeing the southern residents struggling. These two lines on this graph show the number of times the orcas appear in the Salish Sea compared to the number of salmon that have escaped through through the river system. So how many salmon have left the river systems compared to whale days? And you can see that there's a really direct relationship here. And particularly when we get into from 2014 on, the number of days that the southern residents are spending in the Salish Sea has really declined compared to previous years, as the salmon escapement has also declined. Now, it's interesting to note that the transient killer whale behavior has also changed in this time. In the early 2000s, if we saw these transient killer whales, we would see one small group traveling by itself. Now we're seeing them traveling in groups of several families together. We're seeing them more often because our harbor seal and harbor porpoise populations are abundant. They are doing really well. And again, they're in the same exact environment as the southern residents, but this population is thriving where the residents are not. Now, if we can't restore the southern residents, if we lose this population, it will be the first extinction where every individual's name was known. And every whale on this screen is a whale who I have spent time with over the years, and it's like losing a friend. When you find out that one of them hasn't come back with their family every year, it's a really hard thing to realize that you're not going to see that friend anymore. So it's a big deal to be doing everything we possibly can to restore this population. Now, one simple question that people often ask is, why don't the southern residents change their diet? Why don't they eat something else? And that is an excellent question. We wish we knew the answer. The whales are certainly capable of eating marine mammals, but they don't. What's very interesting, and again, we don't know why, is that particularly young males among the southern residents will play with, put that in quotes, will play with porpoises in a way that is usually fatal for the porpoise, but then they don't eat it. And we really don't know what the reason is for that. So we don't know why they aren't switching their prey. There is not really anything that is abundant enough and has the right fat and calorie needs for the whales to eat besides other marine mammals. And yet they're not choosing to eat those, even though they're capable of doing it. So we don't know why they have chosen not to, or are so far choosing not to. And the hope for this population, we do have some calves that are being born, and that's really great news. Since 2019, we've had actually 7 new calves, because this slide was made before just last week when K45 was confirmed, the new K-pod calf, the first calf born in K-pod in 11 years, which is really exciting. Some researchers felt that that particular family group was no longer reproductively viable at all. So the fact that there's a new calf there is really, really good news. We're hoping also that when the whales are not being seen here in the Salish Sea, that they are finding salmon out on the coast somewhere that are giving them what they need to sustain these pregnancies. Obviously, the ones that we have seen being born are, mean that those mamas have found what they need, but we also know that there have been other pregnancies that have not made it. There were 3 confirmed pregnancies in J-Pod last fall and only 1 live birth. So it's still hard, but we're seeing these new babies, and we are really, really hopeful. J59 in particular, just born in March, is a female calf, and the female calves are really the hope for this population, because they'll grow up to have more calves in the future themselves. So what's being done about this? How are we trying to address this situation? The Southern Resident Orca Task Force was convened by Governor Jay Inslee. It came up with a series of 49 recommendations and that included new legislation on salmon recovery, pollution prevention, boat noise reduction, and oil spill response. And there's actually an Orca webpage. The state of Washington has an Orca recovery office and its own webpage where they talk about all the different things that they're doing. I apologize that I do not have that web link. It's a pretty recent website that's gone live, but if you search for Washington State Orca Recovery, that website will pop up for you, and you can see in great detail all the things that are happening there. In British Columbia, they've also had some very strict vessel regulations and fisheries closures. They're working on contaminants management and really focusing on recovering salmon in the Fraser River, which is key because, again, when the orcas were coming into the Salish Sea during the summer, they were feeding on the Fraser River Chinook that were schooling, getting ready to head upstream in the fall. And that fishery has essentially collapsed. So that's one of the reasons we're not seeing our southern residents up in the San Juan Islands as regularly in the summer anymore. There are lots of individual actions that we can take to help the orcas. Obviously, reducing toxins, driving less, getting involved in salmon habitat projects and advocacy work. Planting a rain garden is the first suggestion on this list, and that seems like maybe a big ask for some people. Certainly not everyone's in a place where they can plant a separate garden, but one of the reasons for this is that we've recently discovered that there is a chemical in tire rubber. As tire rubber is being eroded off of your tires as you drive around, that actually produces a chemical compound that when Chinook or coho salmon are exposed to it, they have a 50% mortality as a result of exposure to this toxin. And so when it's in stormwater and it runs straight into a body of water without any sort of treatment, then those salmon can be exposed. However, if there is even the smallest amount of filtration through a bioswale or a rain garden, it removes that toxin from the water. So that's something that, if it's at all possible, or if you are, involved in any sort of community planning projects where they're talking about, redoing a road or something, if you can have public comment and get involved and suggest that they put these bioswales and other sorts of rain gardens along the sides of the roads to collect that storm water and filter it a little bit through the natural plants before it gets into the water, that's a really helpful thing to do. The other thing to do is to report whale sightings. The more whale sighting data we have, the more information we have about what's going on with the whale populations here in the Salish Sea. And that's helpful, not just the orcas. Orca Network does have a whale sighting network, as I mentioned earlier. Any sightings that you send in, we will add to our data set. Anyone can report a sighting. You don't have to have any qualifications in particular, although if you want to be a specific whale sighting network volunteer, you can be trained to, on specific things to report. And that's something you can find the volunteer application at our website if that's something you'd like to do. Our sighting information is made available to the public on Facebook in real time and also in an email digest format. So that if you don't do Facebook, you can still get these reports and just kind of have a sense of what's going on in the whale world around here. So if you see a whale, here are some things to report. And I want to emphasize that you do not have to have all of this information present to make a report that's meaningful. Any report that you make, I saw a big whale, I don't know what kind, it was at this place at this time moving in this direction, that's great. That's if we have that information and other people have made similar reports, but maybe they have an identification of what type of whale it was, we can kind of stitch those together and get a picture of what's happening out there. So any information that you have is helpful. Ideally, you will include the time, date, and location, what kind of whale, if you know, how many animals are present, what's their direction of travel, are they doing anything of interest, are they just moving through, or do you see breaching, or do you see what looks like hunting or anything like that. Including photos and videos is really helpful and appreciated, and also including your contact information. Your name would be published with our reports, but none of your personal contact information would be. And when we are watching whales on the water, we often see that there are boats out there with them too. So just a little bit here on the Share the Water program, the boater education program. These are the regulations that boaters are required to follow in the Salish Sea. And if you are personally connected with a yacht club or a marina or any other sort of boating organization and would like a specific presentation about this information, Orca Network would be really happy to come and talk to you. So you can email me at stephanie@orcanetwork.org, and that would be a great way for us to set up a time for me to come and talk to that organization. So the rules now for the southern resident killer whales are that you have to stay a minimum of 300 to 400 yards away. And because most boaters don't know the difference between the southern resident killer whales and the Biggs killer whales, we're just asking most boaters to just stay that 300 to 400 yards away. Don't get any closer. If you do know the difference, you can approach the Biggs killer whales up to 200 yards, but no nearer. And with any of the baleen whales, the humpbacks or grays or minke whales, 100 yards is the legal requirement to stay away. We also ask that people travel under 7 knots on the water at the first sign of any whale. And this is a legal requirement for the southern residents and for the Biggs, but not necessarily for the baleen whales. However, it is the best practice. It's certainly a really good idea. The slower your boat goes, the quieter it is too. So it's going to disturb the whales less. And these rules apply to any watercraft, including kayaks and paddleboards. So these are the basics. BeWhaleWise.org has a much more detailed explanation of the regulations. Unfortunately, they're not really just very simple and clear cut. There's a map there that shows you exactly like how you're supposed to position your boat around a whale, whether you're parallel or in front or behind the whale's path of travel. There's different distance requirements. But if you're staying 300 to 400 yards away from any killer whales that you see, then you're doing pretty well. However, it's important to note that accurately estimating distance over water is an extremely challenging thing to do. And this is true when you're watching from shore as well. So when we see whales and boats together, we need to really stop and think like, am I looking at a violation, or is there more water between the whale and the boat than I think? And that can be a really hard thing to judge. We do want people to report violations if they see them. But it's not always 100% clear what constitutes a violation, and I'll get to that in just a second. So if you see whales, whether there's boats involved or not, if you see whales, this is how you report the sightings. Here's our Orca Network 800 number. You can send an email to info@orcanet.org. Sorry, that should be orcanetwork.org. Or you can send us a message on the Orca Network Facebook page. If you go to the Orca Network Facebook page and you see that there's already reports for the particular whale or group of whales that you're seeing, you can just add a comment right there. You don't have to send a private message. But if it's the first report of the day of that particular whale or group of whales, send a private message to the page, and then we'll start the thread that lets everybody know what's happening out there. So reporting vessel violations. You want to have the same general information as you did for other sightings when you report a vessel violation. But the really critical thing is that you need to include a vessel registration number or a really, really good description of the boat, including its name. The vessel registration number is really the only way that Fish and Wildlife has that they can for sure look up and see who the owner of that vessel is. And that can be really hard to determine if the boat's moving really quickly, or if you don't have a really good lens on your camera to snap a picture that you can zoom in and see what's going on there. And it can be really, really frustrating. I mean, I was out today with a family of transient killer whales in Dabob Bay, and there were a couple boats that were traveling way too fast, too close to the whales, and there was nothing I could do. There was no way to see if they had, even if they had vessel registration numbers displayed properly or not. So there's really essentially no point in making a report there, because they're not going to have any consequences with it. Now, if you can include a photo or a video, and call NOAA or DFW and let them know that you saw this violation, that you have photographic evidence. You can also go to bewhalewise.org. They have an online form that you can fill out and post the photos there. That's the best way to get some response. And even if the photo is inconclusive, or it's not an obvious violation to the eyes of the responders who see that, if they see that, at least the person who owns that vessel is probably going to get some communication letting them know that somebody saw them doing something that they probably shouldn't have been doing. Even if they don't get fined for it, they will at least get told that people are watching. And right now, that's kind of the best we can hope for, because the enforcement resources are so limited. We just really need to get the word out that, people are watching what you're doing out there on the water, and so you should behave yourself, because we will report you. And even if enforcement's not unseen, a proper report can result in a fine or prosecution, depending on what the violation is. So those are that's the information you need to report a violation if you see one. Do keep in mind, though, that if you don't have the vessel registration number or a really good photo or video, it's probably not going to make a lot of difference if you make the report, and it will use up some of those resources, enforcement resources that are available that are really limited. All right, that was a lot of information really quickly. So I hope that sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stephanie, very much. It was a wonderful presentation. There's some questions here, and I think we will we're going to post this on our website, and we will correct that one mistake where it should have said network, and so we'll correct that too, so that they can understand that. There's a couple of questions. One is, do you ever see the gray whales in the Hood Canals, and if they in the Hood Canal around the May area time? And what are they doing there if they get there? What do they eat there?
So I have not heard of gray whales in that area. I did hear about a humpback whale that was in that area a while ago, but it seems like the bridge is maybe something that the larger whales are not as keen about passing through, the Hood Canal Bridge. The transient killer whales, at least a few of the families don't seem to mind it. Mm-hmm. But I would say if you did see a gray whale in Hood Canal, that's definitely worthy of a report to, Orca Network can let the relevant research outfits know, because it would indicate that the whale is looking for food, and it may not find what it's looking for in that environment. Mm-hmm. So we'd want to monitor and just see what kind of body condition is that whale in? Is that whale struggling? Because some of the whales that come into the Salish Sea, when they're looking for food, they don't just know, they don't really share that information with each other. So they kind of have to find the spot where the ghost shrimp are by accident. And there are other places where ghost shrimp might occur. It's just that they are most abundant in that spot around Everett. So that seems to be a really good spot for the whales to hang out and feed. But there are a few other places around, and there could be some in Hood Canal where they'd find what they need to.
Mm-hmm. And in years past, if someone saw them like 20, 30 years ago, it might have been different than what we're seeing right now. Or maybe not. Right.
It's interesting if it were that long ago that they were seen, because that's about when the first Sounders whales were coming into Possession Sound. So that could have been during that 1999, 2000 unusual mortality event. And so those whales were coming in looking for food. Maybe they found it and carried on their merry way. Maybe they beached somewhere else. That does happen, that they just sort of run out of fuel and don't make it any further.
Another question that goes with that, what you said before, is that they won't change the way that they're eating, which it seems like they should. But I think also, why not interbreed with a larger population? It seems like they're orcas. But what, pardon, do they interbreed?
So they could interbreed. They biologically, it's possible, but they do not interact. They seem to avoid each other very specifically, and they can't communicate with each other as far as we know. You know, the calls are really different. Genetically, there's about, is it 10,000 years, 100,000 years? It's a long time period of genetic divergence between those two populations of killer whales. So they're not separate species yet. We refer to them as ecotypes, but they're moving in that direction. So, you know, yes, they could interbreed, and in captivity, you know, members of different populations of killer whales have been artificially bred, but that's not something that we see in the wild.
And you said also the baleen whales, that there was a Hawaiian population, and then there was the ones here on our coast. Do they ever fight, or can they interbreed, or do the groups fight? And that goes for the orcas too. When they're separate, do they ever be aggressive against each other, for both the killer whales and for the baleen whales?
Okay, good question. So with the baleen whales, the humpbacks that are here are they're here during their feeding season when they're here in the summer. And then some of those whales will go south to Hawaii, and some of those whales are going south to Central America. So they are all the same population when they're here feeding, but we distinguish them by where they go to breed. And, you know, there's some rough housing that happens among the males during breeding season, but we don't see any sort of aggressive behavior. Actually, one of the, you know, in terms of aggressive behavior, humpback whales will sometimes intervene when transient killer whales are hunting other species. And there's been a number of documented cases of that happening, including one that happened in at Race Rocks, which is just west of Victoria in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, where there were a couple humpbacks that showed up and interfered with a transient group that was hunting a sea lion. And so they came in and they were trumpeting. They was making a sound through their blowhole, and just, you know, kind of getting up in the whales business and the killer whales business, and basically saying, you're not going to get the sea lion, that's not for you. And the transient killer whales took off. Among the resident and transient killer whales, we haven't seen physical violence. We have seen a couple instances where it seems like there's just sort of a, you're too close, you know, don't even think about it kind of behavior. There was one incident that was witnessed a number of years ago where the southern residents had some young calves in their group, and there were some transients that were coming a little close, and several of the males among the residents kind of took a pass toward the transients to kind of say back off, and they did. And just last summer, there was an incident where there was a group of transients hunting harbor seals up around Smith and Minor Island, and suddenly a group of resident killer whales rather showed up, and the transient killer whales were documented just absolutely turning around and taking off in the opposite direction, going about 20 knots. I mean, they were speeding out of there. So we don't know what happened, you know, if there was vocalization underneath, or there are other things happening under the water that we didn't see. But boy, when those transients saw those residents, they were out of there. They were not interested in staying.
It's amazing that they seem to have territories. I mean, and they respect each other's territories.
Well, it is really interesting that we have these two top, you know, apex predators, but they eat different things. And that's why they're able to share this environment in relative peace, because we don't see them, you know, they're not in the same place often enough that we see a lot of even that level of interaction. I once saw a small group of transients coming down the outside of James Island in the San Juans, and they were spy hopping a lot, and they were really kind of, they were acting a little like they were a little freaked out about something. Something wasn't right. And so we were watching this, and then it turned out that L-Pod in the southern residence was coming down the other side of the island. And as soon as the transients came within clear auditory contact of the residents, they did a 180 and took off the other direction. And I don't know that L-Pod ever knew that they were there, because L-Pod just didn't seem to have any behavioral change. So that was just a really interesting, you know, personal observation of how they really do avoid each other. They're not interested in you know, trying to do any sort of jockeying for dominance or something. They just stay
Sounds like though the residents are a little bit dominant, because it sounds like the other group takes off whenever they see the resident population. So I think there might be a hierarchy that we don't know about.
Yeah, well, which is also really interesting, because, you know, I mean, as humans, we project that because that's kind of how we see it. But the residents are smaller physically, and a smaller number of whales, and yet, yeah, the transients seem to be really like, okay, you're here, so I'm not going to be around. So it's a very interesting. You know, I wish we had some way of understanding better exactly what that situation is, because it is really, there's a lot of curiosities there.
One thing that comes from your talk is that really these are very peaceful animals. They, you know, compared to a lot of mammals where the males fight a lot, it sounds like these males are really nice, giving the food to the women and children, and not too much fighting. It's really an unusual mammal group.
Well, it is interesting. And again, you know, I hesitate to put too much of that sort of value judgment of peaceful or violent or nonviolent, because we also, I mean, if you watch them hunting, you understand why they're called killer whales. There is nothing gentle about the way they take prey, and they will terrorize, you know, again, human judgment, but that's what it looks like to us. They will terrorize their prey for a long time before they actually make the kill. Often it seems because they're teaching a younger one a hunting technique. And so, you know, I've also seen transient killer whales chase porpoises, you know, slowing down and speeding up and just really tormenting this porpoise, and then turning around and going back to their family because they were just, you know, they're just bored. And I don't know, again, I'm projecting my, you know, what do I think is happening here, but I don't really know. We do know there was a case within the last several years where a mother and son transient killer whale encountered another family of transient killer whales. And normally these encounters seem quite peaceful. You know, they'll travel together for a while. That's usually when breeding activity takes place. But in this case, there was a very young calf in the other family group, and the mother helped her son to commit infanticide of this calf.
Oh.
And that's something that no one had ever seen before. So we don't know if that's something that does happen regularly, and this just was something that somebody happened to be there to see it, or if that was really an anomalous behavior. So, you know, they certainly inspire a sense of peace in us when we're watching them. They're such beautiful and awe-inspiring creatures, but I hesitate to say that they're an inherently peaceful animal. It really depends on how you define that for yourself, I think.
There's two more questions. One, or a comment, is that it really shows how much more studying of them has to be done. And number two, you've already talked about the removal of the Snake River Dam. Did you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, so right now we're at a very interesting place with this for a couple reasons. One is that Governor Inslee has just released a report. Well, let me back up a little bit. In the final days of the Obama presidency, there was a lot of effort to try to get an executive order to remove the dams, which didn't happen. And part of the reason it didn't happen is that the Washington state government and our legislative delegation they didn't have the will to do that. They weren't championing that. Well, then more recently, there is a representative from Idaho who is very interested in removing the dams. He would like to see the fish restored to the rivers in Idaho where they no longer are really the population's really suffering. And he has managed to secure some interest on the Oregon side of the border. And now this political pressure is brought to bear on the Washington state government. Governor Inslee just released a report recently about how we could replace the services that are being provided by the lower Snake River dams in such a way that it would be okay to remove those dams. So I do have, let me share my screen again here because, let's see. Pardon me just a second. I shifted things around while we were talking so that.
Okay, I think this has been a really wonderful talk, so I'm going to thank you right now as you're getting the next thing up. But it has so much information.
Well, I thank you so much for the opportunity. I really, this is really my favorite subject, and I'm happy to talk about it to anybody who will listen. So, Patty Murray and Governor Inslee released this report, and this is in response to the February 2021 Simpson Plan. Representative Simpson from Idaho is the person who's working on this now. And what this report, the purpose of this report was to assess if there are reasonable means for replacing the services and benefits provided by the dams, to describe options and plans for a dam breaching. And it was not intended to recommend dam breaching, but to continue a region-wide plan for salmon recovery that may include dam breaching. And at this point, it is a draft report. The public comment period unfortunately ended on Monday, so I can't ask you to participate in the comments. But comments were made, and what the report says that's interesting and sort of represents a little bit more of the kind of response we're hoping to see than we've seen in the past. First of all, is that change is inevitable, and that's kind of a very indirect way of saying we're probably going to have to take these dams down at some point. Also, that the dams are very costly to maintain and operate, and that expense will increase over time, and that dam breaching is the best chance to recover salmon, and the services the dams provide are replaceable. So with proper advanced planning and investment, the services that the lower Snake River dams provide can be fully or partially maintained for multiple industries and sectors, and the negative impacts of dam breaching can be mitigated. So that's a lot closer to saying maybe we should take these dams down than we have ever seen Governor Inslee go before. And right after that, the White House weighed in as well and didn't exactly say, yes, we should bring them down, but was more supportive of this idea. So I think there's getting to be some political will that this could happen sooner rather than later. And
it sounds like it's a good time. I'm going to thank you again. It's pretty close to 8 o'clock, and you've really answered the questions, and the presentation has been very clear. I think we who have listened to it today really should recommend it to our friends to go online and see it. I think it's really a worthwhile presentation. So thank you again.
Please do, and also visit our website. We have our volunteer forms and our whale sighting report forms and all kinds of resources there for you. If you want to know more, that's a great place to go. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you.